This is the second of a series of 3 videos about the wrecks of the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse. Both capital ships were sunk whilst operating as foresaid in a mass attack by 85 Japanese aircraft off the east coast of Malaysia in the South China Sea on 10 December 1941, almost 200 miles north of Singapore. The loss to air attack of the brand new battleship Prince of Wales, whilst underway in the open sea, is seen as defining the end of the era of the battleship. The first video in this series concentrated on the deployment of Prince of Wales and Repulse to Singapore and the fateful sortie from Singapore after Japanese landings had taken place in northern Malaya and southern peninsular Thailand, almost simultaneous with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941. This video will focus on Prince of Wales herself. I took part in a number of expeditions to dive both Prince of Wales and Repulse in the early 2000s before, sadly, along with a number of other British, Dutch and American World War II war graves, these two sensitive British war graves became the subject of intensive illegal salvage work. Both these wrecks have now been greatly damaged, while some of the other wrecks have been completely dismantled and removed, all for their precious pre-Hiroshima steel and non-ferrous metals, or, allegedly, to remove any large wrecks from the South China Sea beside which an enemy submarine could lie hidden. My aim with these 3 videos is to record for posterity what the 2 wrecks were like before this awful salvage work started. The battleship Prince of Wales was constructed within the terms of the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936, signed by most large naval powers, with the exception of Japan and Italy. This treaty was intended to limit a naval arms race and set the displacement limit for future battleships at 35,000 long tons, and it capped the main battery gun size at a maximum of 14 inches. 3 classes of battleships that complied with the terms of this treaty were laid down. They would be the 5 British King George V class fast battleships, whilst the USA would produce their North Carolina and the South Dakota class fast battleships, albeit that when Japan and Italy refused to sign the treaty, the 2 USA classes would be armed with a 16-inch gun. The 5 35,000-ton British battleships HMS King George V, Prince of Wales, Duke of York, Anson and Howe would stick with the 14-inch gun, which was an advanced design with a range of 36,000 yards, over 20 miles, and it had a high rate of fire. There simply wasn't enough time to rework the King George V's class specifications to equip them with a larger 16-inch main battery arrangement. Meanwhile, Germany, who had also not signed the treaty, was busy designing their 2 much larger non-treaty Bismarck-class super battleships, Bismarck and Tirpitz. Japan would soon build their 2 Yamato-class super battleships, Yamato and Musashi, which had a standard displacement of about 68,200 long tons and a full load displacement of 72,000 tons, and which of course were fitted with the largest guns ever installed in a battleship, the monstrous 18.1-inch weapon. When conceived, HMS Prince of Wales was originally to have been named King Edward VIII, but the abdication of King Edward VIII on 11 December 1936 forced a hurried change of name to Prince of Wales before construction started. On 1 January 1937, just 1 month after the abdication, Prince of Wales was laid down at Camel Laird shipyard in Birkenhead, just across the Mersey River from Liverpool. Her construction took more than 2 years, until her hull was finally launched for fitting out afloat before a crowd of 50,000 on 3 May 1939, just 4 months before World War II started. Prince of Wales was still being fitted out afloat when Britain declared war on Germany on 3 September 1939. Some German bomb damage in her fitting out berth, combined with late delivery of gun mountings, caused delays in her completion, but she was finally commissioned a year and a half later, on 19 January 1941. The Admiralty chose Captain John C. Leach to command the new battleship, a talented officer who specialised in naval gunnery and had served in battleships in the First World War. Prince of Wales was 745 feet 1 inch long overall, with a beam of 103 feet and a draft of 34 feet. She displaced 36,727 long tons as built and 43,786 long tons full load. She carried a crew of around 1,500 officers and men. Prince of Wales was powered by Parsons-geared steam turbines that drove 4 large propellers arranged 2 either side of a single large rudder, as seen in this model. Steam was provided by 8 Admiralty 3-drum water tube boilers, giving Prince of Wales a top speed of 28 knots and a range of 10,250 nautical miles at a cruising speed of 15 knots. Battleships protected the most important parts, such as their machinery, the shell rooms, magazines, boilers and the like, inside an armoured box called the Citadel. On Prince of Wales, on either side of the Citadel, was a 23-foot high waterline armour belt, which ran from just forward of A turret to just abaft Y turret and extended 15 feet below the waterline. To illustrate the idea, it is the thick red line at the waterline on this cutaway sketch of the German World War I König-class battleship. The vertical armour belt was 14 inches thick abreast the machinery and 15 inches thick abreast the magazines. Extending 15 feet below the waterline, the armour belt was designed to protect against hits by the heaviest armour-piercing shells and by shallow-run torpedoes or surface mines. The vertical waterline belt is shown as a thick black line in this Admiralty cutaway diagram. Deeper inside the ship was a second longitudinal vertical armoured bulkhead, which I've arrowed here. This ran inboard along either side of the Citadel and was 1.5 to 1 3/4 inches thick. This was designed to stop splinters from shells that penetrated the armour belt, or to catch spalling from the inside of the armour plates if the belt was struck, but not fully penetrated. Transverse armour bulkheads ran athwartships across the ship, connecting both ends of the waterline side armour belts to form the armoured box of the Citadel. The forward bulkhead was 11.7 inches thick. The after bulkheads were 9.8 inch and 4 inches thick. I've added a simplified version of the Citadel on this illustration of the wreck of Prince of Wales just to show the concept. The bottom of the Citadel was the double bottom of the keel. On Prince of Wales, the upper deck of the Citadel was 1 inch thick and was intended to explode any falling high explosive shells and decap armour-piercing shells. Below the upper deck lay the main armour deck, which had 6 inch thick horizontal armour over the magazines and 5 inches over the machinery. This was intended to detonate any armour-piercing shells. Much further down inside the ship, the magazines had a further 1.5 inch thick horizontal armour splinter deck above them that was designed to catch any splinters penetrating from shells exploding far above. In this cutaway of the German König class of World War I, the lower horizontal splinter deck is shown as a thick red line with sloping sides just beneath the coal bunkers. The underwater side protection system protected the gap between the bottom of the waterline armour belt and the flat bottom of the keel itself. I've arrowed the area on this cutaway here. The side protection system was designed to deal with torpedo and mine hits below the vertical waterline armour belt. In this armour plan of the King George V class, the outer skin of the ship underneath that waterline armour belt is simple shell plating. Immediately inboard of the hull shell plating were a number of watertight voids or compartments that were filled with air or could be flooded with water. Any torpedo blast penetrating the outer shell plating would partially dissipate into these voids. Some way further inside the ship was a series of mild steel longitudinal bulkheads that ran along the side of the ship and created spaces that were filled with oil, fuel and water. These light steel bulkheads were designed to bend or buckle and absorb any remaining explosive force penetrating from the hit outboard. By buckling and not shattering, the bulkheads would not produce any dangerous splinters that could penetrate further into the ship. Another air or water-filled, watertight compartment lay further inboard before the 1.5 to 1 3/4 inch thick armoured anti-torpedo bulkhead gave final protection to the ship proper inside. On the King George V class battleships, the anti-torpedo bulkhead was approximately 14 feet inboard from the outside of the ship. This intricate system of voids and layers of oil and water-filled compartments came to be known as the liquid sandwich, and in the King George V units, the side protection system was designed to withstand torpedoes and mines with warheads up to 750 pounds. Most of the aerial torpedoes carried by Japanese torpedo bombers at Pearl Harbor and in the battle to come in the South China Sea carried a 330-pound charge. So if a Japanese aerial torpedo had hit the waterline armour belt or the underwater torpedo defence system below, then the explosive charge would have been taken relatively easily. However, The most modern battleships of World War II still had an Achilles heel. More of that later. Prince of Wales was fitted with a main battery of 10 14-inch Mark 7 guns, which had a maximum range of almost 22 miles. These guns were mounted in 3 turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft. 4 guns were installed in the foremost A turret, with each gun able to elevate and depress independently. The 4-gun turret was complex, as can be seen from this image of A turret of King George V herself under construction. A super-firing 2-gun B turret was mounted abaft A turret, just in front of the bridge superstructure. A further 4-gun 14-inch Y turret was set aft towards the stern, and this arrangement offered a broadside salvo of 10 14-inch shells every 40 seconds. The armoured cylinders that housed the ammunition hoists and turning apparatus for the turrets, called barbettes, ran down through the ship towards the magazines and the bowels of the ship, and had armoured walls that were up to 16 inches thick. The secondary armament on Prince of Wales consisted of 16 dual-purpose, quick-firing 5.25-inch Mark I guns. These were arranged in 8 twin mounts, 4 on either side of the superstructure. These much-vaunted guns were the heaviest dual-purpose guns used by the Royal Navy in World War II. They could elevate to 70 degrees and depress to -5 degrees. Their maximum range was almost 14 miles at a 45-degree elevation, whilst the upper limit for anti-aircraft use was 49,000 feet, higher than most of today's jets fly at. The design rate of fire was 10 to 12 rounds per minute, although 7 to 8 rounds per minute was more average. Along with the main and secondary batteries, Prince of Wales carried an anti-aircraft battery of 6 sets of 8-barrelled quick-firing 2-pounder Vickers pom-pom guns, so called due to the sound that earlier models made when firing. These 8-barrel mounts had 2 rows of 4 guns and came to be known as the Chicago Piano. Prince of Wales also carried the much respected 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft autocannon and a number of rapid-fire close-range 20mm Oerlikon light cannons. There was a saying in the US Navy at the time that when you heard the Oerlikons open up, it was time to hit the deck, as the enemy would be close. Finally, there were Lewis machine guns and 80 unrotated projectiles, an ingenious short-range rocket-firing anti-aircraft weapon which deployed a mine suspended on a wire from 3 parachutes in front of an approaching aircraft. When the aircraft hit the wire, the mine would be pulled up into contact with the plane. Although Prince of Wales was commissioned on 19th January 1941, she was still carrying out training exercises at Scapa Flow and was far from complete when in May 1941 the Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen broke out into the Atlantic Ocean to terrorise Atlantic convoys. Prince of Wales, along with the battlecruiser Hood and 6 destroyers, was ordered to take station south of Iceland to intercept. At Scapa Flow, Vickers Armstrong technicians were still aboard working on their guns to fix failures that had already occurred during training, and they had to remain aboard as the new battleship sorted for Iceland. The Bismarck raiding party was detected by the British heavy cruiser Suffolk and was tracked by radar through the Denmark Strait as Prince of Wales and the Hood sped at 27 knots to engage. In the subsequent famous Battle of the Denmark Strait on 24th May 1941, Prince of Wales closed the Bismarck, and as can be seen in this track of the fall of shot from Prince of Wales, fire was opened at 26,500 yards, just over 15 miles. The first salvo was 1,000 yards over, but the range was quickly established and Prince of Wales' third salvo straddled Bismarck. Tragically, the battlecruiser Hood was quickly hit by Bismarck and blew up in a catastrophic magazine explosion that killed all bar 3 of her crew. Prince of Wales went on to score 3 hits on Bismarck, which forced an end to the German raid into the Atlantic. Wounded by Prince of Wales, Bismarck had to turn and run for France for repairs as British warships closed for the kill. Bismarck would be sunk 3 days later on 27th May 1941. Following repairs at Rosyth to her battle damage, Prince of Wales next took Winston Churchill across the Atlantic to Newfoundland for the Atlantic Charter Conference with US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who met Churchill aboard Prince of Wales. Churchill then arrived back at Scapa Flow on board Prince of Wales on 18th August 1941. In October 1941, just over 2 months before the famous Japanese surprise raid on Pearl Harbor, to deter the threatened Japanese invasion of Thailand, Malaya and Singapore, Churchill determined to send a small but powerful naval squadron to Singapore ships that could catch and kill any enemy ship. Prince of Wales was eventually selected as flagship for this small squadron, which included the reconstructed battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The small, powerful squadron would be commanded by Admiral Sir Tom Phillips and would have an escort of 4 destroyers, whilst the aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable would provide fleet air defence, which would be augmented by RAF land-based planes based throughout Malaya. The powerful squadron arrived at Singapore on 2nd December 1941 and, in a show of force to reassure the population, sailed round Singapore Island and then up the Johor Strait before entering the naval dockyard to a rapturous welcome. My family were actually living in Singapore at the time and would have been aware of the fanfare of the arrival of these famous warships. Ominously, the carrier Indomitable ran aground in Jamaica in November and had to head to the USA for repair. She would not reach Singapore in time, and Force Z would be reliant on their own anti-aircraft weaponry and land-based RAF air cover. But as the great British warships arrived to fanfare in Singapore, no one knew that Japan had already made the decision to go to war with the USA, Britain and Holland, and that Japan's 6-carrier strike force was already halfway across the North Pacific en route to attack Pearl Harbor less than a week later on 7th December 1941. The full story of the events that unfolded and led to Force Z being decimated on 10th December 1941 is recounted in the first video in this series. But briefly, at dawn on 4th December 1941, just 2 days after the British warships arrived in Singapore, Japanese troop transports carrying an invasion force of more than 26,000 troops left ports in China on a 4-day incessant passage bound for landing beaches in southern Thailand and northeast Malaya, such as Singora, Patani and Kota Baru. The Japanese landings began early in darkness on Monday, 8th December 1941, almost simultaneously with the strike on Pearl Harbor. RAF airfields throughout northern Malaya were bombed, and by the end of the day, the RAF in northern Malaya had been largely decimated. Through all of this, Prince of Wales and Repulse still lay berthed at Singapore. Faced with multiple beach landings to the north, with Singapore now being bombed and the RAF devastated in the north, Admiral Phillips sortied Force Z at dusk that evening of 8 December 1941, with the intention that his warships would arrive off the Japanese invasion beaches at Singora at first light a day and a half later on 10th December. With the element of surprise, his powerful ships would then smash the Japanese troop transports and devastate Japanese forces ashore with a naval bombardment. However, the next day, 9th December, Force Z was spotted heading north by a Japanese submarine. Later that afternoon, at 4:45, just 1 hour before sunset, when darkness would hide the British warships from the Japanese, the skies cleared and Force Z was quickly spotted by 3 Japanese reconnaissance seaplanes, which shadowed Force Z until sunset. With the element of surprise lost, after a few hours of darkness, the raid on Singora was eventually abandoned and Force Z turned to run southwest, initially towards Kota Baru, but then south towards Kuantan, halfway down the Malayan Peninsula, when it was reported that Japanese troops were landing there. As first light crept over the horizon at 5 a.m. on 10th December 1941, Force Z was about 70 nautical miles off Kuantan. All ships went to full action stations, and as dawn arrived, lookouts saw no enemy planes or surface vessels. But an hour and a half later, at 6:30 a.m, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft appeared and began shadowing Force Z. Meanwhile, in Saigon, almost simultaneously at 5 a.m, 9 Japanese Mitsubishi G4M long-range reconnaissance bombers, Allied reporting codename Nell, took off and headed south, fanning out to sweep the South China Sea and find out where Force Z now was. 1.5 hours later, at 6:30 a.m, 85 Nell and Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers took off from Saigon, carrying a mixture of high-altitude bombs and aerial torpedoes. The 85 Nell and Betty bombers flew slowly south, waiting for the 9 Nell scout planes far ahead to spot Force Z. After almost 4 hours of flight, at 10:15, 1 Nell found Force Z and sent back details of the location, heading and strength of the British naval force, and provided a directional signal. The 85 Japanese bombers now headed directly for Force Z. At 11 a.m, within 1 hour of being spotted, a first squadron of 8 Japanese Nell bombers came into view of the aforesaid warships below. Each of these Nells was carrying a single 550-pound bomb. All aforesaid warships went to action stations, repel aircraft, and on Prince of Wales, gunnery officers on the 5.25-inch high-angle guns began to plot the range, height and speed of the enemy aircraft. But as the gunnery officers on the British warships were working, signal flags were hoisted in Prince of Wales, ordering all ships to turn together 30 degrees to starboard. As the turn to starboard began, 4 of the 5.25-inch high-angle mounts on the starboard side of Prince of Wales were able to train on the enemy. The order "commence, commence, commence" was given, and anti-aircraft fire was opened at about 12,000 yards. But it was immediately noticed that the anti-aircraft shells were exploding to the right of the Japanese bombers, which were not taking any evasive action at all. The swing of the great battleship to starboard was counteracting the tracking corrections to the left being given to the 5.25-inch guns. And then, as the starboard turn became more pronounced, the guns in the starboard beam had to cease firing as the huge superstructure of Prince of Wales masked the line of fire. The turn to starboard continued, and as the Japanese aircraft came in sight of the port 5.25-inch guns, they were able to open fire. But just as the port guns began firing, Admiral Phillips signalled all ships to turn 50 degrees to port. The new turn to port now caused the port guns, which had just opened fire, to cease firing as the superstructure again masked the Japanese planes. For a few moments, no anti-aircraft guns at all fired in Prince of Wales, before the turn to port allowed the starboard guns to begin firing once again. These cumbersome fleet manoeuvres by signal flag had robbed the gunnery officers of the opportunity to settle down to a long run of firing that would have enabled corrections to be made and more effective fire to be brought against the unswerving compact formation of Japanese planes. Admiral Phillips now signalled that ship commanders had freedom of movement, but radio silence was still being maintained and no call was made for the squadron of Brewster Buffalo fighters earmarked for fleet defence that were sitting on the ground at Singapore, just an hour's flying time away. At about 11:30, the 8 Nell high-altitude bombers released their bombs simultaneously. Most were near misses that straddled Repulse, but one hit Repulse amidships, penetrating the upper deck to burst in the armoured splinter deck below. Although there were a number of casualties, her speed was unaffected. She steamed on, trailing a small curl of smoke. In this famous archive photo taken from a Japanese plane, Repulse at bottom left is straddled by near misses, whilst Prince of Wales at top right manoeuvres at speed, her wake revealing a turn to port before a subsequent pronounced turn to starboard. With the first bombing wave over, Force Z resumed steaming south towards Singapore, but within minutes, radar in Prince of Wales picked up an even larger force of planes approaching. At this point, with complete radio silence being maintained, no one in Singapore knew where Force Z actually was. At 11:38, 17 high-level bombers and 50 torpedo bombers began their attack from about 8 miles away, splitting up to make simultaneous bombing and torpedo attacks on both Prince of Wales and Repulse, and thereby split British anti-aircraft fire. The Nell and Betty bombers flew across the bows of the southbound British ships whilst out of range before forming up in line astern as they increased speed and began to drop towards Force Z. The first line of 9 torpedo bombers, each carrying a torpedo with a 330-pound warhead, split up in 3 neat turns, 3 aircraft each turn, to now face towards the Prince of Wales port beam in a huge extended arc that was flying directly towards the great battleship at about 180 miles per hour, some 100 to 150 feet above the water. All 8 portside 5.25-inch dual-purpose guns in the 4 twin turrets opened fire, to be joined by the Bofors 40mm on the quarterdeck. Then the 4 8-barrel Chicago piano pom-poms began pumping out their 2-pound shells. Finally, the shorter-range rapid-fire 20mm Ehrlichens and machine guns opened fire. Tracers arced up towards the black dots in a sky that was peppered with black bursts of flak. After 12 salvos, the 5.25-inch guns switched from controlled fire at individual planes to barrage fire, throwing up a curtain of flak, but the gunners were not prepared for the fast speed of 180 miles an hour that the Japanese planes approached at. These gunners had trained to repel attacks at 100 miles per hour, the speed that the Royal Navy's own Fairey Swordfish biplanes attacked at. Most British shells burst behind the Japanese aircraft as they roared towards the British ships. The torpedo bombers dropped their torpedoes once they were between 1,500 to just 600 metres from the huge port beam of the Prince of Wales. Captain Leach ordered hard a port in an attempt to comb the tracks of the torpedoes, which were set to run at a depth of 6 metres at 25 knots. But before the crash turn to port could be completed, 2 torpedoes hit Prince of Wales aft, one on the port beam aft, which caused little damage to the side armour belt and torpedo protection system. The second torpedo, however, struck a battleship's Achilles heel, the unarmoured area at the stern, out with the armoured box of the citadel, where the rudders, propellers and shafts had to be free to operate. This was the critical strike that doomed the Prince of Wales from this point on. Prince of Wales had 4 propellers, each blade the size of a man. The torpedo hit just forward of the bracket that supported the free tail section of outboard propeller shaft, the top propeller in this model. The torpedo strike blasted a hole in the hull that was 6 metres by 4 metres wide and was very close to where the prop shaft entered the hull. Inside the ship here, the shaft alley was large enough for a man to stand upright in, and this shaft alley ran all the way forward inside the ship for about 200 feet to B engine room. The great battleship was moving at flank speed, and this outboard propeller was rotating at 204 revolutions per minute. But now damaged, it was turning out of centre, and it began to vibrate violently, weakening the struts of the hull support bracket that held the free tail section of propeller shaft and the propeller itself in place. Fierce vibrations ran along the shaft for 200 feet all the way to B engine room, damaging watertight glands around the shaft and transverse bulkheads and allowing a direct route for water to flood up the prop shaft alley. The violent vibration now sheared the 17.5-inch diameter steel propeller shaft itself, and the suddenly free length of tail propeller shaft along with the hull bearing bracket and the huge propeller broke free and fell to the seabed, ripping the internal stern section of propeller shaft out of the hull. To redress the port list, the voids of the starboard side protection system were counter-flooded, and this successfully reduced the list to 10 degrees. The flooding aft had caused our stern to settle by 1.5 metres. Worse still, as the outboard port propeller, hull bracket and propeller shaft fell away to the seabed, debris entered the port inboard propeller race, second from the top in this model, damaging its blades in operation and forcing its turbine to be shut down. Both port propellers were now out of action, and the battleship slowed further to 15 knots. After seeing Prince of Wales begin to list, at 11:58 Captain Tennant aboard Repulse finally broke radio silence and radioed Singapore for help. If the Fleet Defence Brewster Buffalo fighters had been requested earlier, when Force Z was first spotted, despite the poor performance as fighter aircraft, they would still have made short work of the Japanese bombers, which had no fighter protection at this long range. But now that radio silence had been broken and the perilous state of Force Z had been revealed, 11 Brewster Buffalo fighters stationed at Singapore took off immediately, but it was already too late. 15 Japanese bombers now attacked the Repulse, and Captain Tennant successfully combed the tracks of all the torpedoes and avoided all the high-level bombs dropped from 12,000 feet. Then, this phase of the Japanese attack ended at 12 noon, and an eerie lull descended. Meanwhile, inside Prince of Wales, the flooding aft had plunged corridors into darkness and caused failure of the electrical system that powered the after 5.25-inch anti-aircraft gun mounts. Water also damaged internal communications and systems for training and elevating the anti-aircraft guns, such that none could now be trained properly. Without power, both steering motors were dead, the steering gear jammed, and this large single rudder was initially unable to function, although an attempt to switch to emergency steering was made. The remaining 2 starboard propellers were still operational, but with the rudder jammed, they caused the battleship to veer to port in a long, slow turn. The lull ended at 12:19 when another swarm of Japanese aircraft attacked, by when, with the list to port and the starboard beam risen higher, those anti-aircraft guns on the starboard beam of Prince of Wales that could still fire could not now depress sufficiently to hit the 6 torpedo bombers that attacked the battleship's starboard beam. 3, possibly 4 torpedoes struck Prince of Wales in quick succession. One hit forward of the citadel at the very bow, blowing a 7-metre diameter hole completely through the unarmoured bow from starboard, venting to port. This image of the German battleship Gneisenau in dry dock in 1940, after being torpedoed by the British submarine HMS Clyde, illustrates the type of damage Prince of Wales sustained from this hit. The second torpedo was a hit just above the forward edge of the bilge keel, detonating on the very bottom of the thick armour belt. The bottom armour plates were pushed inwards, and the blast was deflected downwards to blow in the outer skin of the side torpedo defence system and create another 7-metre wide hole. Here is an image of the US battleship California after the Pearl Harbor raid, which illustrates the sort of damage Prince of Wales sustained from a similar Japanese aerial torpedo, although California's waterline belt was smaller at 17 feet high, whereas the armour belt in Prince of Wales was 23 feet high. With the voids of the starboard torpedo defence system counter-flooded to reduce the port list and now filled with incompressible water, these voids likely did not dissipate the blast as designed. No one knows how far inboard the blast penetrated, but had the ship not been listing to port, this torpedo would have hit square on, higher up the vertical waterline side armour belt, which would have handled the impact. The third torpedo struck the hull just abaft Y turret, weakening and shearing the struts that supported the outboard starboard propshaft bearing, shown in this image. The struts sheared halfway up, and now free, the rotating tail propshaft whipped around and jammed the remaining attached sections of the bearing struts and one of its blades under the still functioning inboard starboard propeller shaft. With the outboard propeller now knocked out of action, only this inboard starboard shaft was now operational, and the ship's speed dropped to 8 knots. With Prince of Wales clearly mortally wounded, 20 torpedo bombers now attacked Repulse from all sides in a starfish attack. Such was the number of torpedoes in the water simultaneously that it was impossible for Repulse to comb all the tracks, and in the course of 4 to 5 minutes Repulse was hit by 4, possibly 5 torpedoes, and quickly started to list to port. The attacks ended at 12:30, and by 12:32, just 11 minutes after the attack beginning, Repulse capsized and disappeared beneath the waves. She was gone, and 513 of her crew were dead. At 12:41, 8 Nell high-altitude bombers carrying 500-kilogram bombs now attacked Prince of Wales. While some bombs were near misses that produced compressions of her shell plating beneath her armour belt, one bomb damaged X boiler room, which powered the one remaining starboard inboard shaft. All 4 propellers were now out of action, and the great battleship wallowed to a stop, continuing to settle slowly deeper into the water by the stern and listing to port. Survivors recalled that it looked as though the tide was coming in, as water slowly crept up her decks. An eerie silence now descended, and at 1 p.m. the order to abandon ship was given. In this iconic photograph, as gunners remain at their posts in their anti-flash gear, hundreds of men are attempting to cross over to the Destroyer Express, which had come alongside. Makeshift lines and gangplanks were put across the gap between the two ships, but as Prince of Wales rolled further to port, the gap widened and the gangplanks fell into the sea. Men continued to swing across the gap on ropes, but the situation was getting desperate now, and some men were falling to their death between the two ships. At 1:15 p.m, some 90 minutes after the first torpedo attack, the starboard beam of Prince of Wales rose up under the Express, forcing her to pull away as the hulls ground together. At 1:20 p.m, the first pair of Brewster Buffalo fighters arrived from Singapore to find the badly listing Prince of Wales in a great slick of oil. The anti-aircraft gunners aboard the stricken battleship had remained at their posts, and they now bravely opened up in the distant planes, believing them to be Japanese, until RAF aircrew fired a recognition flare. Shortly afterwards, 10 more Brewster Buffalo fighters arrived. Hundreds of men were still left in Prince of Wales. They congregated at the highest points, the forecastle and the starboard gunwale, and as she went right over onto her port beam ends, they walked down the now exposed starboard side and jumped into the water. The battleship then went completely over until her flat bottom was exposed. Then, upside down, the great bow rose into the air as she settled by the stern, the torpedo hole in the bow clearly visible to crew struggling in the water. Given the moderate depths, it is likely that the stern grounded in the seabed as the bow rose up. Japanese aircraft had remained in the vicinity watching events unfold, but they made off at speed as the Brewster Buffalo fighters arrived. The belated arrival of the British fighters brought jeers and booing from crewmen now in rafts or struggling in the water. 327 crew from Prince of Wales had died, almost half the number of casualties on Repulse, and this was largely due to her modern battleship design with extensive subdivision and compartmentalisation that had kept her afloat for 90 minutes and given her crew time to get off. The much older Repulse had sunk quickly in 11 minutes. In all, 840 British sailors had perished in the battle, and British sea power in the Far East had been annihilated. In 2001, I was taken as a civilian expert on a 2-week military expedition to dive both these wrecks. We spent 1 week diving on each wreck. I was able to return on a number of occasions in the years that followed, although I have not been able to get back since the illegal salvage and desecration of these sensitive war graves started more than 10 years ago. Given that each of these wrecks has now been heavily salvaged, I thought it would be helpful for posterity if I recorded what I can about them from those dives. Some 50 miles off the east coast of Malaysia and almost 200 miles north of Singapore, after her last propeller had been knocked out of action, Prince of Wales had wallowed immobile on the surface for some time before finally sinking. During that time, the prevailing 2-knot monsoon current had gently pushed her around until she was beam on to the current. Prince of Wales then capsized to port before, upside down, she finally disappeared beneath the surface into 68 metres of water. As she went, the battleship's huge top hamper and superstructure quickly contacted the sandy seabed, probably stopping her from going completely inverted. As her great weight then settled downwards, her top hamper, masts and smokestacks were crushed before much of her superstructure was driven into the sandy seabed. She came to rest on the seabed at an inclined angle, port rail lower in the sand with the starboard beam higher. Like most battleship wrecks I have dived, such as the 3 German World War I König-class battleships at Scapa Flow, König, Markgraf and Kronprinz Wilhelm, Prince of Wales has not remained on the seabed exactly as she was when she sank. Being at an inclined angle, and hence unbalanced, for every second of every minute, of every hour, of every day, of every year since then, the gravitational effect of the colossal weight of the battleship has fought against the yielding seabed as the ship attempted to become fully inverted and achieve a balanced equilibrium. And as the wreck essentially continued to capsize on the seabed, her great weight has driven the superstructure and turrets deeper and deeper into the seabed over time, until today she is almost but not quite fully inverted. The wreck today lies with her port gunwale low, buried in the sand from A turret aft. The incline of the wreck means that her higher starboard gunwale is held a few metres off the seabed from the bow to amidships, creating a cavernous dark overhang under the deck. Take a moment to look at this photo of the superstructure and realise just how much of this has been driven deep into the seabed. When the huge wreck, some 745 feet long, is broadside to the monsoon current, the current produces a scouring effect that at times stirs up the sandy seabed into vast clouds. The top of the wreck is at a depth of 50 to 55 metres, and the flat bottom can be bathed in sunlight penetrating down through clear tropical water. However, as soon as you go over the side and descend towards the seabed, you often encounter a cloud of stirred up sand and silt that can drop the visibility quickly down from more than 50 metres to sometimes just 3 or 4 metres. At the bow, the almost plumb stem is narrow and sleek, designed to slice through the water. It rises almost vertically from the prow at a depth of about 65 metres, all the way to the upturned forefoot in about 50 to 55 metres. The times I dived it, like many large wrecks worldwide, there was a trawl net snagged over it. Just a few metres abaft the stem, and about 1/3 of the way down from the keel to the deck, I found the first of the 3 torpedo impact sites on the starboard side. The torpedo had blasted a hole completely through the narrow bow, severing the stem and leaving a 7-metre wide hole from one side of the ship to the other, similar to this archive photograph of the Gneisenau. Although this looked bad, the hole was well forward of the transverse armour bulkhead, in front of the 4 14-inch guns of A turret. Yes, the bow compartments affected would have flooded, but the flooding would have been contained in this area, essentially by a collision bulkhead. If this had been the only hit, she would have settled by the bow, but her fighting ability would otherwise have been unaffected. Prince of Wales had two anchors on the starboard side, and both the forward bower anchor and the sheet anchor abaft were still held snugly in their hawse pipes on the wreck. On top of the wreck, as you move aft along the keel from the stem, the keel begins to flare outwards to the full 103 feet wide beam. Longitudinal docking keels can be seen here and there, as in this archive image of the US battleship New York. Essentially, these docking keels are long steel boxes that are filled with oiled wood. They spread the weight of the battleship across its frames and allow it to sit safely in dry dock without the shell plating of the keel and the ship's watertight integrity being damaged. On either beam, in the midsection of the wreck, a slender 3 to 4 feet high bilge keel can be seen running along the middle section of the ship. Essentially, bilge keels are thin strips of metal that give the flat bottom of the hull a cutting edge for manoeuvring and also dampen any roll of the ship. On my first dive in the wreck in 2001, I dropped down to the seabed near the bow, looking to see if I could spot the famous four 14-inch guns of A turret. After getting into the right area, in poor silty visibility of just a few metres, I made my way under the overhanging upper deck, which still had its teak decking. The light quickly disappeared and it became completely dark. Although this is a photograph of Y turret, I would have been almost exactly where Churchill is standing in this photograph. After venturing into the darkness for just a few metres, I came to the tip of the outermost starboard 14-inch barrel, which seemed to be lying on top of the silt, as you can see from this poor photograph I took. The remainder of the top of A turret was well buried in the seabed. I pushed on further under the hull and soon came to the inboard starboard gun barrel, again seemingly lying on top of the silt. I then spotted in the distance a thin sliver of diffuse green light and realised that I was looking at free water beyond the port rail in the distance. The penny then dropped that the whole forepart of the ship was held off the seabed from A turret to the prow by the superstructure and gun turrets. Although the bow section is incredibly strong with its transverse armour bulkhead and horizontal armour decks, it was still an eerie thought that there was 35,000 tonnes of best British battleships suspended above my head. I swam completely across the 103 feet beam of the ship into free water at the other side, and then followed the port guardrail aft until it disappeared into the sand. I then turned and made my way back under the overhanging deck, past the front of A turret to the starboard side where I had entered, to continue my exploration aft. The two-gun superfiring B turret, originally above and behind the four-gun A turret, was now deeply buried in the seabed, with only a section of the barbette showing. Moving aft along the starboard gunwale, I looked up and I could see the overhanging step out of the waterline side armour belt. The individual locking plates that made up the belt were smoothly fitted together, with no large seams or rivets. The plates are attached to the hull by large bolts that are tapped into the plates from inside the hull, the large bolts going through the shell plating of the hull itself, then through 2 inches of teak, before tapping into the backside of the armour plates. Some way aft from where the armour belt began, I located the second starboard torpedo impact hole, another gaping 7-metre wide hole in the hull that was between the bottom, now top, of the waterline armour belt and the very beginning of the starboard bilge keel, in the area of the underwater side protection system called the liquid sandwich I mentioned earlier. As you can see from this grainy photo in poor visibility, the torpedo seemed to have detonated on the very bottom edge of the armour belt, pushing in 1 to 2 plates as a blast effect was deflected downwards to blow the 7-metre wide hole in the side protection system, deforming the very beginning of the bilge keel in the process. In this photograph that Guy Wallace shot of me beside the torpedo hole, you can see the bottom of the armour belt just beside my left heel, and the plates there are all pushed inboard. Below, now above the armour belt, you can see how the thin shell plating of the torpedo defence system has just been rent open and all the plates are buckled and bent. It may help if I invert the image to suggest that the battleship was sitting correctly upright as afloat. This image of a similar strike with a similar Japanese aerial torpedo on the US battleship California during the Pearl Harbor raid just a few days before, on 7th December 1941, shows the damage to its torpedo defence system and is similar to that which occurred to Prince of Wales. The underwater side protection system on Prince of Wales was designed to handle hits of up to 750 pounds of a warhead. The Japanese torpedoes carried an attack were a mixture of the Type 91 Model 1, which had a 330 pound explosive charge, and the Model 2, which had a larger 450 pound explosive charge. In any event, the torpedo defence system on Prince of Wales should have been able to handle the effects of the explosive charge. Being a war grave, none of our team ventured inside this hole to see what damage actually occurred to the liquid sandwich, although it would have been fascinating to know. As the ship listed to port after the first crucial torpedo strike on the port side aft, watertight compartments on the starboard side here in the side protection system were counter-flooded to reduce the port list. Minds greater than mine will be able to assess what effect that counter-flooding would have had on the effectiveness of the side protection system, and whether with the voids counter-flooded, the blast effects would have penetrated through the oil and water-filled bulkheads of the liquid sandwich and got to the innermost anti-torpedo bulkhead, which, if compromised, would have allowed flooding of the internal ship. It should also be noted that the torpedo hit the very bottom edge of the lowest armour plate, pushing it inwards. Following the earlier first hit on the port side aft, Prince of Wales had listed to port, raising the starboard beam higher in the water. If the ship had not been listing to port from this first strike, it is clear from our dives that this torpedo would have hit the armour belt square on, and the belt armour would have been able to handle the explosive charge. Continuing to move aft just above the seabed, the four starboard twin-barrelled 5.25-inch quick-firing dual-purpose gun turrets can be found. The foremost was numbered S1, and both its barrels are still in place and are trained forward. Turret S2 is situated just behind it. Both 5.5-inch barrels appear to be lying on the seabed. Near them, a Carley float life raft lies on the seabed. The large crane used for launching and retrieving the boom boats and for recovering the seaplane back on board after it landed in the water and taxied alongside lies flat on the seabed. Just abaft the seaplane crane can be found two more secondary 5.25-inch gun turrets, with the working chamber for one of the gun turrets lying flat on the seabed nearby. The aft part of the ship clearly reveals the immensity of the tragedy that engulfed it and the mechanics of how the great ship was sent to the bottom. When I dived Prince of Wales in the early 2000s, all three remaining propellers were still on the wreck, telling the complete story. They are all gone today. On the port side, the 6-metre diameter hole in the hull caused by the crucial first torpedo strike can be found just beside the location of the now missing cutlass bearing that supported the free or tail section of outboard port propeller shaft and the propeller itself. This circular bearing is usually lined with lignum vitae or similar and is held to the hull by two robust support struts, as can be seen in this image of the USS Missouri. The outboard port propeller, the free section of tail prop shaft, the support bearing and its two struts were all missing from the wreck. The torpedo hit had weakened the hull structure and the two bearing support struts. The ship was moving at flank speed and the propeller shaft was rotating at 204 revolutions per minute. The damage to the hull caused by the first torpedo caused the shaft to rotate out of line, and the stresses involved sheared the two support struts and broke the 17.5-inch diameter steel propeller shaft. The propeller, which would have likely weighed around 45 tons, then fell away to the seabed, pulling the internal section of shaft partially out of the hull. This series of photographs by Craig Challen from 2008 reveals how the shaft rotated out of line, damaging hull plating, and how sections of internal propeller shaft have been sheared apart at the flanges and moved out of position. The photos also show how the internal watertight bulkheads and glands throughout the prop shaft alley have been damaged. Water now surged in through this gap in the hull, searching its way up the prop shaft alley through the damaged bulkheads and glands for some 200 feet inside the hull to B engine room. It was water from this first port side torpedo strike that brought on the port list and caused the battleship to settle by the stern. This was the crucial and fatal hit. The inboard port propeller, its tail shaft and support bearing were still present and undamaged at the time of our inspection, but the blades of this prop were missing large sections of their edges and tips, where debris from the outboard port propeller falling to the seabed damaged it, forcing it to be shut down. Moving across the keel to the starboard side, we find that because the ship had settled by the stern by the time of the starboard beam attack, the aftmost torpedo strike hole is located much higher up the side of the ship than the corresponding first hit on the port side aft, which was deeper in the water nearer the propeller itself. The hole in the starboard side is just under the row of portholes beneath the upper deck, and is consequently now lower towards the seabed. In this photo you can see near the bottom some of the portholes that ring the fantail just beneath the main or upper deck. As a result of this torpedo hit, the outboard tail shaft bearing struts were broken. The suddenly free outboard propeller, still with the bearing and the remains of the two sheared struts attached, jammed itself below, and now above, the inboard shaft. The outboard propeller blades are heavily damaged, as it was still rotating when the struts broke and it jammed itself into this position under the inboard tail shaft. In the next two photographs, you can see the inner starboard propeller shaft at bottom left of shot, and we're looking at the outer propeller itself, and you can see a huge chunk taken out of one of the blades at top right of shot, and it's actually the struts for the bearing that supported the free section of prop shaft behind this propeller that have jammed themselves under the inner propeller shaft. The inboard starboard propeller was the last propeller to go out of action of all four during the battle, and you can see from these photos how the propeller blades themselves are largely undamaged. The large single rudder is still upright and angled 10 to 20 degrees to starboard. We know from survivor accounts that the main steering motors had jammed when the power failed in the aft part of the ship. It is believed that some attempts were made to give emergency steering of the rudder, and because the ship was making a crash turn to port with her rudder hard aport when she was struck by the first torpedo, the fact that the rudder today is at 10 to 20 degrees to starboard indicates that there was time before the steering failed to manoeuvre the great rudder around into the starboard orientation. It may be that given it was obvious that both port propellers had been put out of action, that even if the steering motors had failed, the emergency steering system was enough to get the rudder round to 20 degrees to starboard in an attempt to counteract the push to port of the operational starboard propellers and allow the ship to make way ahead. The narrow stern of the battleship is crumpled near the very bottom, which is either from the near-miss bomb damage or from the stern grounding on the seabed as she began to sink, and her colossal weight pressing down as she pivoted on her stern and capsized. So that's a brief tour of the wreck of HMS Prince of Wales as it was before the awful salvage work started. But although everyone in the tech diving community is shocked by what has taken place, there is a little good news. A battleship has several ship's bells, and as successive warships take the same name, the main bell is passed from the old ship to the new ship. There have been 7 ships in the Royal Navy named Prince of Wales, the first being constructed in the 1700s, whilst the name is carried forward to one of our 2 present-day Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers. I know from talking to one of the survivors of Prince of Wales that the main bell was taken inside the superstructure and secured in a cradle for safekeeping when the ship went into action that day, 10th December 1941. It will still likely be there inside the wreck today, deep below the level of the seabed, inside the buried superstructure. But in 2002, a smaller bell was spotted by technical divers lying free in the seabed, partially buried in the sand. The discovery of this bell led to a huge combined British military-civilian operation called Operation Reclaim to recover the bell for our nation, as word was others were looking to try and get it. The successful Operation Reclaim is a fascinating story and is recounted in detail in a brilliant new book by my good friend and regular dive buddy Paul Haynes called The Frogmen. You can read more about the tragic sinkings of Prince of Wales and Repulse in my own book, Foresaid Shipwrecks of the South China Sea. If you have enjoyed this video, part 3 about the wreck of HMS Repulse will follow in due course. Meantime, don't forget to like this video or subscribe to my channel. Fair winds and following seas.